They did not smell clean. They smelled like winter, sweat and wood smoke trapped in stone. In the heart of every medieval castle, behind layers of gowns and silence, women held onto forgotten rituals of hygiene that barely kept them warm, let alone truly clean. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let us embark on this journey together tonight. If you enjoy drifting through these quiet corridors of history, consider joining us for more tales of the past told in whispers and shadows. Picture yourself standing in the great hall of a castle on a January morning in the year 1347. The stones beneath your feet are cold, so cold they seem to pull the warmth from your very bones. Frost patterns climb the inner walls like skeletal fingers, and somewhere in the distance you hear the muffled sound of wind howling through arrow slits. This is where women lived, where they woke each morning to darkness, where they moved through their days wrapped in wool and fur and desperation, where hygiene was not a matter of comfort, but of survival. The winter morning begins before dawn. There is no sunrise to mark the hour, only the gradual shift from black to grey, from the darkness of night to the darkness of winter. A noblewoman stirs beneath her pile of furs, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air of her chamber. She does not leap from bed. She cannot. The cold is too fierce, too immediate, too absolute. Instead, she moves slowly, pulling the furs tighter around her shoulders, feeling the stiffness in her joints from a night spent curled against the cold. Her first thought is not of cleanliness. It is of warmth. It is always of warmth. The chamber pot beneath her bed has not been emptied since the night before. It sits in the corner, half frozen, the contents inside forming a crust of ice along the rim. The servant girl who should have taken it away at first light has not yet arrived, delayed perhaps by the snow that fell during the night, or by the treacherous ice that coats the spiral staircases, or by the simple fact that in winter everything moves slower, everything becomes harder. Everything requires more effort than it should. The noblewoman ignores the pot. She has grown accustomed to its presence, to the sharp smell that mingles with the wood smoke and the mustiness of damp stone. In winter there are no pleasant smells. There are only degrees of unpleasantness, layers of odor that settle into fabric and hair and skin until they become invisible, until no one notices anymore, because everyone carries the same scent of survival. She does not wash her face. There is no water in the basin on the small table near the window. The water froze during the night, expanding in the ceramic bowl until it cracked, a thin line running from rim to base like a scar. The servant girl will bring more water later, perhaps, if the well has not frozen, if the buckets can be lifted without the rope snapping from the cold, if there is time between all the other tasks that winter demands. But even when the water comes, it will not be for washing. It will be for drinking, for cooking, for the essential tasks that keep life moving forward. Washing is a luxury that winter does not permit. Instead, the noblewoman reaches for the linen cloth that hangs from a peg on the wall. It is stiff with old sweat and oils from her skin, darkened by weeks of use, but it is all she has. She presses it against her face, rubbing at the corners of her eyes where sleep has gathered, wiping at her mouth, her forehead. The cloth scrapes against her skin, rough and unforgiving, but this is cleanliness in winter. This is what hygiene means when water is frozen, and soap is scarce and warmth is measured in heartbeats. She does not feel clean afterward. She feels attended to, which is different, which is something. Her hair is another matter entirely. It hangs loose around her shoulders, unwashed for weeks, perhaps months. In summer, she might have rinsed it in rose water, might have sat by an open window while a servant combed through the tangles with a wooden comb dipped in sweet oils. But this is not summer. This is the deepest part of winter, when the world outside is white and silent and merciless, when the castle itself seems to groan under the weight of ice and snow, when survival is the only goal worth pursuing. Her hair is greasy at the roots, dry and brittle at the ends. She gathers it with both hands, twisting it into a thick rope, coiling it at the base of her skull. She covers it with a linen coif, then a woolen veil, layers of fabric that hide the unwashed strands, that trap the oils against her scalp, that keep her head warm even as they seal in the smell of her own body. Beneath her nightgown, her skin itches. It always itches in winter. The woolen chemise she wears next to her skin has not been changed in days, perhaps weeks. It clings to her body, damp with sweat despite the cold scratchy against her arms and back and breasts. Lice move through the fabric, tiny creatures that have made their home in the seams and folds, that bite and crawl and multiply in the warmth generated by her body heat. She scratches absently, her fingers moving over her ribs, under her arms, along the back of her neck. Everyone has lice in winter. The servants have them, the knights have them, the lord of the castle has them. They are as much a part of winter as the cold itself, as unavoidable as breath, as constant as hunger. She does not remove her chemise to inspect the bites. The cold will not allow it. Instead, she layers more clothing on top. Another chemise, this one made of linen that has yellowed with age and wear. A kirtle of heavy wool, lined with fur at the neck and wrists. An overgown that drags on the floor, collecting dust and rushes and small bits of debris as she moves through the castle. A belt pulled tight at her waist, from which hang various items. A small knife in a leather sheath, a ring of keys that mark her status, a pomander filled with dried herbs that she holds to her nose when the smells become too much to bear. The pomander is supposed to ward off disease, to purify the air she breathes, but mostly it is a small comfort, a tiny sphere of rosemary and lavender in a world that smells of decay and desperation. Her feet are wrapped in strips of wool before she slides them into soft leather shoes. The shoes are lined with straw for extra warmth, but the straw has become compressed and damp, losing its insulating properties so that the cold still seeps through, still numbs her toes until she can barely feel them. She will walk carefully today, mindful of the ice that coats the floors in the unheated corridors, mindful of the places where water has leaked through the stones and frozen into treacherous patches. A fall could mean a broken bone, and a broken bone in winter could mean death, slow and painful and inevitable. When she finally emerges from her chamber, the castle is beginning to wake around her. Servants move through the corridors like shadows, their faces pinched with cold, their hands red and chapped from endless work. They carry buckets of water drawn from wells that threaten to freeze solid, armfuls of wood for fires that never seem to provide enough heat, baskets of soiled linens that will be washed in icy streams if the streams have not frozen over completely. The women among them, the chambermaids and kitchen maids and laundry maids, carry the particular burden of maintaining hygiene in a place where hygiene is nearly impossible. Consider the laundress, a woman whose name history has not bothered to record, who rises before dawn to face her daily battle against filth. In summer, her work is difficult but manageable. She can wash linens in warm water heated over fires, can spread them in the sun to dry and bleach, can beat them with paddles until the dirt loosens and runs away in cloudy streams. But in winter, her work becomes a kind of torture. The stream where she washes is partially frozen, the water so cold it makes her hands ache within seconds of immersion. She breaks the ice along the banks, kneeling on stones that are slick with frost, plunging the soiled linens into water that steals the feeling from her fingers. The linens she washes are stained with blood and urine and sweat, with the evidence of bodies that cannot be kept clean, that leak and shed and betray their owners despite all efforts at containment. Menstrual cloths soaked through with dark blood, chamber pot linen splattered with waste, bed sheets marked by nocturnal emissions and the slow seepage of unwashed bodies. She scrubs at the stains with a harsh soap made from wood ash and animal fat, a caustic mixture that burns her already cracked skin, that turns her hands red and raw and bleeding. The soap does not smell pleasant. It smells like fire and flesh, like something rendered down to its most basic components, like survival stripped of all grace. Even when the linens are scrubbed, they are not truly clean. The water is too cold to dissolve the oils and dirt completely, and the soap is too weak to lift the deepest stains. But this is the best that can be done. The laundress wrings out the heavy fabric with numb hands, her fingers barely able to grip, and then she must find a place to dry them. In summer, she would spread them on bushes or drape them over low walls in the courtyard. In winter, there are no such options. The courtyard is buried in snow. The bushes are skeletal and frozen, and anything left outside would freeze solid within an hour. So she hangs the linens inside in the great hall near the fire, or in the kitchens where the ovens provide some warmth, and there they drip slowly onto the floor, adding to the dampness that permeates everything, that makes the stones slick and the air heavy with moisture. The drying takes days, sometimes weeks. Wet fabric hangs from every available surface, creating a maze of dripping cloth through which the inhabitants of the castle must navigate. The linens never dry completely. They remain damp and cold, carrying within their fibers the smell of smoke and mildew. And when they are finally returned to the chambers and beds of the castle, they bring with them a clammy chill that seeps into the skin of anyone who touches them. This is cleanliness in winter. This is the best that can be achieved. In the kitchens, other women face their own battles with hygiene. The cook, a thick woman with arms like hams and a face permanently reddened by heat and exertion, presides over a domain of fire and grease and organized chaos. The kitchen is the warmest place in the castle, warmer even than the great hall, because the ovens and hearths burn constantly, consuming enormous quantities of wood, filling the air with smoke and the smell of roasting meat. It is also the dirtiest place, where scraps of food litter the floor, where blood pools in the grooves between stones, where rats scurry in the shadows and flies gather despite the cold. The cook does not wash her hands between tasks. There is no basin of clean water available for such purposes, no soap set aside for the workers who knead dough and pluck fowl and gutfish. Her hands are perpetually stained, darkened by soot and blood and the oils of countless ingredients. She wipes them on her apron, a garment so stiff with accumulated filth that it could probably stand on its own, and then she plunges them back into whatever task demands her attention. Dough is kneaded with hands that just gutted a rabbit. Vegetables are chopped on a board still marked with the blood of yesterday's venison. Meat is turned on a spit by a scullery girl, whose arms are covered in open sores, whose face is marked by smallpox scars, who coughs wetly into her elbow before returning her hands to the food. No one dies from this. Or rather, many die, but not immediately. Not in ways that can be traced directly to the dirty hands that prepared their meals. Disease is understood differently in this time. Illness comes from bad air, from imbalances in the humors, from the alignment of planets or the will of God. It does not come from unwashed hands or flies landing on food or rats' droppings mixing with flour. So the cook continues her work, and the food that emerges from her kitchen is consumed by everyone in the castle, from the lowliest servant to the lord and lady themselves. And if it carries within it the seeds of future illness, no one knows, no one suspects. No one connects the fever that comes in March to the meal prepared in January. The great hall, where the castle's inhabitants gather for meals and warmth, and the semblance of community, is its own study in the limits of medieval hygiene. The floor is covered with rushes, dried reeds and grasses that are supposed to absorb spills and provide a soft surface for walking. In theory, the rushes are changed regularly, swept out and replaced with fresh ones. In practice, especially in winter, the rushes remain on the floor for months, slowly composing beneath the feet of all who walk upon them. Food scraps fall into the rushes and are forgotten. Bones gnawed clean by diners are tossed over shoulders to land among the reeds. Dogs urinate against the walls, and the liquid seeps into the rushes, mixing with spilled ale and wine and the tracked-in snow that melts into dirty puddles. Chamber pots are sometimes emptied into the rushes when the servant, tasked with disposal, is too tired or too cold to make the journey to the proper disposal site. The smell that rises from the floor is complex and nauseating, It is the smell of decay, of rot, of organic matter breaking down in the perpetual dampness. It mingles with the smoke from the central hearth, with the smell of unwashed bodies crowded together, with the scent of food both fresh and spoiling. The inhabitants of the castle are mostly nose-blind to it. They have lived with these smells for so long that they no longer register as offensive. Only newcomers, visitors from other castles or travelers seeking shelter, notice the stench, and they learn quickly not to comment, not to show their disgust, because this is simply how castles smell in winter, how all indoor spaces smell when warmth is prioritized over cleanliness. When survival trumps comfort, women sit at the long tables in the great hall, their gowns brushing against the foul rushes, their hands reaching for shared platters of food. They do not wash before eating. They have not washed in any meaningful way for days or weeks. Their hands are dirty, their nails edged with black crescents of accumulated grime. They tear bread with these hands, dip the bread into shared bowls of stew, bring the food to their mouths. Fingers are the primary utensils. Knives are used for cutting meat, but spoons are rare and forks are non-existent. Food is eaten with hands, and hands are wiped on bread or clothing when they become too greasy to function properly. The noblewoman at the high table fares little better than the servants at the lower tables. She has a napkin, a cloth reserved for her use, but it is as dirty as everything else, stained with wine and grease from previous meals. She dabs at her mouth with this cloth, leaving behind traces of food that will dry into the fabric, that will attract flies when the weather warms. Between courses, a servant brings a bowl of water for rinsing fingers, but this same bowl is used by everyone at the high table, and by the time it reaches the end of the line, the water is cloudy with dissolved food and oils, more likely to spread dirt than remove it. After the meal, the tables are cleared but not cleaned. Servants scrape the worst of the scraps into buckets for the pigs, but the wood of the tables remains stained and sticky. Spilled wine soaks into the grain, creating dark patches that never truly dry. Grease from meat leaves shiny smears that accumulate dust and small debris. The tables, like everything else in the castle, carry the marks of countless meals, layers of use that build up over time, creating surfaces that are perpetually dirty, perpetually marked by the evidence of human consumption. When night falls and the inhabitants of the castle retreat to their chambers, the rituals of bedtime offer no more cleanliness than the rituals of mourning. The noblewoman returns to her room, her body aching with cold despite the hours spent near the fire in the great hall. She is tired, bone-deep tired, the kind of exhaustion that comes from living in perpetual discomfort, from never being truly warm, from the constant effort required to simply exist in winter. She does not undress completely. To do so would be to invite the cold in, to expose her skin to air that feels like knives. Instead, she removes only her outer layers, unlacing her gown, stepping out of the heavy fabric, draping it over a chest at the foot of her bed. Beneath the gown, she wears multiple layers that she will sleep in. The chemise, the kirtle, stockings held up with garters, all of it will remain on her body through the night. She will sleep clothed, because to sleep naked would be to wake frozen if she woke at all. The bed itself is a fortress against the cold, built up with layers of defense against the winter night. First, the wooden frame raised high off the floor to avoid the worst of the drafts that swirl along the stones. Then the rope strung across the frame, sagging with age and use, creaking when weight is applied. On top of the ropes, a mattress stuffed with straw, lumpy and uneven, harboring within its ticking all manner of small creatures, lice, fleas, bedbugs, beetles, mice that have burrowed into the warmth. The mattress smells of mildew and old sweat, and the sweet decay of aging straw. It has not been emptied and restuffed in years. Such maintenance is a warm weather task, something done in summer when the straw can be taken outside, when the mattress ticking can be washed and dried in the sun. In winter, the mattress remains as it is, growing more compressed, more infested, more malodorous with each passing month. The noblewoman climbs onto this mattress without hesitation. She has slept on it for months, perhaps years. It is her bed, familiar in its discomfort, and familiarity is its own kind of comfort when everything else is hostile. On top of the mattress, she has piled blankets and furs, as many as she could acquire, layered thick against the cold. The furs still carry the smell of the animals they came from, a wild musk that never quite fades. The blankets are wool, scratchy and heavy, woven tight to trap heat. She burrows beneath these layers, pulling them up to her chin, cocooning herself in fabric and fur. Her breath creates a small pocket of warmth around her face, but even this warmth is tinged with the smell of her own body, the sour scent of unwashed teeth, the stale air that has been cycled through her lungs and expelled into the small space beneath the blankets. She does not brush her teeth before sleep. She has no toothbrush, no concept of dental hygiene as a daily practice. If her teeth ache, she might rub them with a cloth or chew on a stick of birch to clean them. But these are remedies for discomfort, not preventative measures. Her teeth are already yellowed, already beginning to decay. She is young still, perhaps 25, but her mouth holds the teeth of someone much older. Several molars are missing, lost to abscesses that swelled her jaw and brought fever and pain that no. The remaining teeth are loose in their sockets, sensitive to heat and cold, prone to sudden sharp pains that make her gasp and press her hand to her cheek. This is normal. This is expected. This is what happens when you live in a world without dentistry, without understanding of the tiny organisms that colonize mouths and digest sugars into acids that eat through enamel. Her mouth is a source of constant low-level discomfort, a reminder that her body is slowly failing, slowly breaking down under the accumulated weight of poor hygiene and limited medical knowledge. But tonight, like every night, she ignores the ache in her jaw, the sensitivity of her teeth, the taste in her mouth that is never quite clean. She closes her eyes and tries to find sleep in the darkness of her chamber, in the cold that presses in from all sides, in the knowledge that tomorrow will bring more of the same, more cold, more discomfort, more small indignities of a body that cannot be kept clean. In other chambers throughout the castle, other women face their own versions of this nightly ritual. A young maid sleeps on a pallet in the corner of her mistress's room, her thin body barely protected by a single blanket. She shivers through the night, waking frequently to add wood to the dying fire, to check that her mistress is still breathing beneath her mound of furs. A cook's assistant sleeps in the kitchen, curled on a bench near the ovens, the warmth a luxury that compensates for the hardness of her bed and the smell of old grease that permeates everything. Her laundress sleeps in the linen room, surrounded by stacks of damp fabric, her hands still aching from the day's work in the frozen stream, her dreams troubled by visions of endless soiled sheets that she can never quite get clean. None of them are clean. None of them smell pleasant. None of them have bodies free from lice and sores, and the general filth that accumulates when water is frozen and soap is scarce and warmth is prioritized over all else. But they are alive. They are surviving. And in the brutal logic of a medieval winter, survival is its own kind of cleanliness, its own kind of virtue. Morning comes again, grey and cold and indistinguishable from the morning before. The routines begin anew, identical to yesterday, to the day before that, to all the days that stretch back through the long winter. Wake, dress in layers that have not been washed, eat with hands that have not been cleaned, work through tasks that leave you dirtier than when you started, sleep in garments and beds that accumulate filth with each passing night. This is the rhythm of winter in a medieval castle. This is the life that women lived, day after day, month after month, until the spring finally came, and brought with it the possibility, though not the guarantee, of something approaching cleanliness. But spring is still months away. It is only January, and the winter has barely begun to show its true cruelty. The cold will deepen, the ice will thicken, the stores of food will dwindle, and with them the energy and resources needed to maintain even the minimal standards of hygiene that currently exist. As winter progresses, things will get worse. They always do. Consider the matter of menstruation, a reality of women's lives that could not be ignored, that arrived every month with its own demands and discomforts. In this era, There are no disposable pads, no tampons, no convenient products designed to absorb and contain menstrual blood. There is only cloth, strips of linen or wool that are folded and positioned to catch the flow, held in place by nothing more than the pressure of tightly laced undergarments and the hope that they will not shift and cause leaks. These menstrual cloths are reused month after month, washed when possible, and simply shaken out when washing is not an option. In summer, a woman might rinse her cloths in warm water, might scrub them with soap, might hang them in the sun where the light would bleach out some of the stains and kill some of the bacteria. In winter, these options do not exist. The cloths are rinsed in cold water if water is available, scrubbed half-heartedly with harsh soap that reddens the hands, wrung out and hung near the fire to dry. But they never dry completely, and they never become truly clean. The bloodstains remain brown and rust-colored, permanent reminders of the body's monthly cycle. The smell of these drying cloths mingles with all the other smells in the chamber, a sharp metallic scent that cannot be masked by herbs or perfumes. It is the smell of iron, of blood, of the body's interior made external. Men find it distasteful, this evidence of women's biology, and so the cloths are hidden as much as possible, dried discreetly, stored out of sight. But in winter, discretion is a luxury. The cloths must dry somewhere warm, and warm places are shared spaces. So the evidence of menstruation becomes public knowledge, something that cannot be hidden, cannot be made invisible. The experience of menstruating in winter is its own particular misery. The cold makes cramps worse, the muscles clenching harder, the pain radiating from abdomen to lower back to thighs. There is no hot water bottle to press against the aching belly, no warm bath to ease the discomfort. There is only the choice to lie still and endure, or to continue working and ignore the pain as best as possible. Most women choose to continue working. There is no concept of menstrual leave, no acknowledgement that this might be a time when rest is needed. Work continues regardless of bleeding, regardless of pain, regardless of the added burden of managing menstruation with inadequate supplies in hostile conditions. Leaks are common and deeply embarrassing. A woman might feel the warm wetness spreading through the cloth, might know that it has soaked through her chemise and is now staining her kirtle. There is no opportunity to change immediately, no private moment in which she can remove the soiled garments and replace them with fresh ones. She must continue through her day, aware of the stain, aware that others might see it, might know what it signifies. Later, when she finally has a moment alone, she will try to scrub out the stain with cold water and harsh soap, but blood is stubborn, especially when it has been allowed to dry. The stain will remain, faded perhaps, but visible, a mark of shame that she will try to hide beneath other layers of clothing. Some women, particularly those of the servant class who have no extra garments to layer, simply live with the blood. They wear the stained chemises until the stains are so numerous that they blend together into a general discoloration. This is not slovenliness. This is not lack of care. This is simple reality. Clothing is expensive, washing is difficult, and in winter both become nearly impossible. So you wear what you have, stained or not, and you accept that your body will mark your clothing, will leave evidence of its functions, and that this is simply one more indignity to be endured. The noblewoman has it marginally better. She has more changes of undergarments, more supplies of cloth for managing her menstruation. But she still faces the cold, still must manage her bleeding in conditions that are far from ideal. She still experiences the discomfort of damp cloths against her skin, the fear of leaking during a formal meal, the humiliation of having servants see and handle her menstrual rags. Status provides more resources, but it does not eliminate the fundamental challenges of being a woman in a medieval castle in winter. Then there is the matter of the latrine, the garderobe, the privy, that essential space where the castle's inhabitants go to void their bowels and bladders. These rooms are small, often just a stone seat with a hole cut through it, positioned over a shaft that drops down to a cesspit below, or in some castles, opens directly onto the outer wall, so that waste falls into the moat or onto the ground far below. The seat is stone or wood, both equally cold, both capable of stealing the warmth from your body in seconds. To use the latrine in winter is to subject yourself to a particular kind of torment. First there is the journey, through cold corridors, up or down spiral staircases, to the small chamber that houses the privy. This journey cannot be made quickly. The floors are icy, the stairs treacherous, and haste could mean a fall. So you move carefully, clenching your muscles, trying to delay the inevitable until you reach your destination. When you finally arrive, the small chamber offers no warmth, no comfort. Often there is ice on the walls, frost patterns climbing the stone. Your breath clouds in the air as you lift your skirts, as you lower yourself onto the freezing seat. The cold of the stone against your bare flesh is shocking, painful even. Your body recoils from the contact, muscles tensing when they should be relaxing. It takes a conscious effort to force yourself to remain seated, to allow your body to do what it needs to do. Below you, in the darkness of the shaft, you can hear the drip of other people's waste, or in the deepest cold, nothing at all because everything has frozen solid. The smell rises up through the hole, trapped by the cold concentrated in the small space. It is overwhelming, eye-watering, the smell of human waste in all its varieties, accumulating over weeks and months because the cesspits are not emptied in winter, because the ground is too frozen to dig, because the workers who would do such unpleasant tasks are already stretched thin by all the other demands of winter. There is no toilet paper. Instead, there are squares of cloth, or for those of lesser means, handfuls of straw or moss. These materials are kept in a basket near the privy seat, shared by everyone who uses this particular latrine. The cloth squares are not washed between uses. They are simply folded to present a clean side, used again, folded again, used until they are so soiled that they must be either washed or discarded. The straw and moss are slightly better in that they are discarded after each use, tossed down the hole to join the waste below, but they are rough, scratchy, and thoroughly inadequate for the task they are meant to perform. Women wipe themselves with these materials as best they can, but cleanliness is impossible to achieve. The cloth is too soiled, the straw too rough, the moss too inadequate. There is always residue, always a feeling of being not quite clean. This residue will sit against the skin for the rest of the day, perhaps longer, because there is no opportunity to wash, no water to spare for such purposes. It will cause itching, irritation, sometimes infection, but these are minor concerns in the larger struggle of winter survival. You learn to live with discomfort. You learn to tolerate the feeling of being dirty, because the alternative, trying to achieve cleanliness in conditions that make it impossible, will drive you mad. After using the latrine, there is no hand washing. There is no basin of water, no soap, no towel. You simply pull your skirts down, arrange your layers of clothing, and return to whatever task was interrupted by the need to relieve yourself. Your hands, which have just touched soiled cloth or straw, which may have come into contact with your own waste, are the same hands that will prepare food, that will serve meals, that will touch the faces of children, that will handle the intimate tasks of daily life. This is not carelessness. This is simply the reality of a world where water is frozen, where soap is a scarce commodity, where the concept of germs does not exist, and therefore the connection between dirty hands and disease cannot be made. Some of the wealthier women have chamber pots in their rooms, which spares them the journey to the communal latrine. These pots are ceramic or metal, wide-mouthed vessels that can be positioned beneath the body while squatting or sitting on the edge of the bed. Using a chamber pot offers privacy and avoids the cold journey, but it comes with its own set of problems. The pot must be emptied, and this task falls to servants who are already overburdened with work. In winter, the contents of the pots sometimes freeze, becoming solid masses that must be chipped out with tools, melted near the fire, then carried through the castle to be dumped in the cesspit or thrown from a window onto the ground below. The servants who handle these pots do so with bare hands, or at most with thin cloths wrapped around their palms. The pots are heavy, especially when full, and carrying them through narrow corridors and down icy stairs is dangerous work. Spills are common. A servant might slip on the ice, the pot flying from her hands, its contents splattering across the floor, across the walls, across her own clothing. These spills are cleaned up as best as possible, but in winter the smell lingers, frozen into place, a reminder that will not fade until the thaw finally comes. The process of bathing, that most basic of hygienic practices, is reduced in winter to something between a memory and a dream. In summer, the castle might fill a large wooden tub with water heated over the kitchen fires, and the lord and lady would bathe, sitting in the warm water, having their bodies scrubbed by servants with cloths and soap. This was a rare luxury even in summer, happening perhaps once a month or less. In winter, it becomes impossible. The amount of wood needed to heat enough water to fill a tub is enormous, and wood is needed for cooking, for heating the great hall, for keeping people alive. It cannot be spared for baths, so people do not bathe. They go weeks, months, the entire winter without immersing their bodies in water. The dirt accumulates in visible layers. It darkens the creases of the neck, the insides of the elbows, the spaces between fingers. It forms a kind of crust in places where sweat and oils collect, under the breasts, in the groin, behind the ears. This crust can be felt when you move, a slight stiffness, a resistance of the skin against itself. It can be seen when you undress. Rare as that is, dark marks on pale skin, evidence of weeks without washing. The skin begins to develop problems. Rashes appear where fabric rubs repeatedly against dirty skin. Boils form, red and painful, filled with pus that eventually ruptures and drains, leaving sores that are slow to heal in the cold. Fungal infections take hold in warm, moist places, between the toes, under the arms, in the folds of the groin. These infections cause itching, burning, sometimes pain, but there is little that can be done for them. The remedies that exist, poultices made from herbs, salves made from animal fats, are marginally effective at best. Mostly you simply endure, scratching when you think no one is watching, trying to find relief that never quite comes. Some women attempt a kind of dry washing, what would later be called a sponge bath. They dampen a cloth with whatever small amount of water they can spare, perhaps warming it briefly near the fire, and they wipe at their bodies, focusing on the areas that smell the worst, the armpits, the feet, the groin. This provides a moment of relief, a brief sensation of freshness, but the cloth itself is rarely clean, having been used for this purpose multiple times without proper washing, and so it mostly just redistributes the dirt rather than removing it. Still, it is something, an attempt at hygiene in conditions that make true hygiene impossible, and that attempt matters, at least psychologically. For women of childbearing age, there is an additional concern, the possibility of pregnancy and the hygiene challenges that come with it. Pregnancy in this era is dangerous under the best circumstances, and winter pregnancy is worse. The pregnant woman's body requires more food, more warmth, more care, all of which are in short supply during the cold months. Her body changes in ways that make hygiene even more difficult. Her belly swells, making it hard to reach her own feet, to see what she is doing when she uses the latrine. Her breasts become heavy and tender, leaking a thin fluid that stains her chemise. Her bladder is compressed by the growing child, forcing her to urinate frequently, making multiple trips to the freezing latrine each day and night. If she is noble, she may have a midwife or female relatives to help her through the pregnancy. If she is a servant, she has only her own strength and determination to rely upon. Either way, when the time comes for the birth, it will happen in winter in a cold room with limited resources and much danger. The birthing chamber will be closed up tight to keep out drafts, which means it will also trap the smells of labor. Blood, sweat, feces if she evacuates her bowels during the pushing, the metallic scent of the afterbirth when it finally emerges. The midwife will attend her with hands that have not been washed, using cloths that have been used for other births, carrying within her the unknowing potential to transmit childbed fever, that mysterious killer of new mothers. If the woman survives the birth, if the child lives, then comes the period of lying in, when she is expected to rest for weeks while her body recovers. But rest does not mean cleanliness. She lies in a bed that is already dirty, wearing a shift that becomes soaked with blood and other fluids, surrounded by the smell of her own body recovering from trauma. The bleeding after birth continues for weeks, requiring constant management with cloths that must be changed and washed, though in winter the washing is cursory at best. The child, if it is nursing, must be held against her body, must root at her breast, must be cleaned when it soils itself. All tasks that require touching, handling, intimate contact with bodies that are never truly clean. The infant itself faces its own hygiene challenges. There are no disposable diapers, only cloth wrappings that must be changed when they become soiled, which is frequently. The cloths are rinsed in cold water if water is available, hung to dry near the fire and reused again and again. They develop a permanent stain, a yellowish-brown discoloration that no amount of washing can remove. They develop a smell too, the smell of old urine and feces that has soaked into the fabric fibers and will never completely come out. The baby is wrapped in these cloths, its delicate skin in constant contact with damp, soiled fabric, and so it develops rashes, red, angry patches that make it cry and squirm. The mother treats these rashes with whatever remedies she knows. Oil, if any can be spared, or a paste made from flour and water, or simply by leaving the baby's bottom exposed. Bathing an infant in winter is an act that balances necessity against danger. The baby must be cleaned, but immersing it in water risks making it too cold. So the washing is done quickly, with warmed water if possible, or more often with damp cloths that are wiped over the baby's body while it cries and shivers. The mother works fast, her hands clumsy with cold and haste, cleaning the creases where dirt collects, the folds of the neck and the backs of the knees, and the tiny spaces between fingers and toes. She dries the baby quickly, wraps it in whatever clean cloth is available, holds it against her own body to share warmth. This is love, this is care, this is doing the best that can be done in circumstances that are hostile to the vulnerable. Throughout all of this, the castle itself is deteriorating, slowly becoming dirtier, more dilapidated, more inhospitable. The stones sweat with condensation, creating damp patches that grow mold, black and green colonies that spread across the walls. The wooden beams overhead accumulate soot from the fires, becoming dark and stained. The tapestries that hang on the walls, meant to provide insulation and decoration, become repositories for dust and smoke, their bright colors fading to dull grays and browns. Behind these tapestries, in the gaps between fabric and stone, mice build nests, insects lay eggs, colonies of small creatures thrive in the darkness. The great hall's central hearth burns constantly, consuming wood at a prodigious rate, filling the space with smoke that rises to the ceiling and leaks out through gaps in the roof. But much of the smoke does not escape. It lingers in the hall, a grey haze that makes eyes water and throats burn. People who spend their days in the great hall develop a chronic cough, a rattling in the lungs that never quite clears. Their eyes become reddened and irritated. Their skin takes on a grey cast, as if the smoke has settled into their pores and changed their very colouring. The smoke adheres to everything. It coats the walls, the tables, the clothing of everyone who lives in the castle. It mixes with grease and dust to form a sticky layer that cannot be easily removed. Servants wipe at surfaces with damp cloths, but the grime simply smears, spreads thinner, reappears within hours. The battle against dirt is endless and ultimately futile. The castle is a place of accumulation where every day adds more filth, more disorder, more evidence of human habitation, and where winter prevents any meaningful cleaning or restoration of order. In this environment, insects thrive despite the cold. Fleas, which live on the bodies of humans and animals, continue their life cycles, protected by the warmth of the host body. They bite constantly, leaving itchy red welts that people scratch until they bleed, until the wounds become infected, until scars form that will last for years. Lice, both body lice and head lice, move through hair and clothing, laying eggs in seams and along strands of hair. These eggs, called nits, are tiny white specks that cling stubbornly, resisting all attempts at removal. The lice themselves are grey-brown creatures barely visible to the naked eye, but their presence is undeniable. They cause itching so intense that it dominates thought, that makes it difficult to concentrate on anything else. Some women try to fight the lice. They ask servants to search through their hair, to pick out the nits one by one. A tedious process that takes hours and provides only temporary relief, because the lice always come back. They wash their hair in solutions made from herbs thought to repel insects: rosemary, lavender, pennyroyal. These herbs smell pleasant, which is something, but they do not actually kill or repel lice. The insects continue their infestations, continue their breeding, continue their feeding. By midwinter, everyone in the castle is infested. The itching is universal. The sound of scratching, fingernails against fabric, against skin, becomes part of the background noise of daily life, as common and unremarked as the crackling of fires or the howling of wind. Bedbugs are another constant torment. These insects hide in the cracks of bed frames, in the straw of mattresses, emerging at night to feed on sleeping humans. Their bites are painless at first, delivered with an anesthetic that allows them to feed undetected, but later the bites swell and itch intensely. A person might wake in the morning covered in bites, small red marks in clusters or lines where the bug walked across skin, feeding multiple times. The bedbugs leave behind other evidence too: small dark spots on the sheets, their excrement, and sometimes tiny bloodstains where a fed bug was crushed by a rolling body. Getting rid of bedbugs is nearly impossible with medieval technology. The frames can be taken apart and scrubbed, but the bugs hide in crevices too small to reach. The mattresses can be emptied and the straw burned, but the bugs have already laid eggs in the bed frame, in the walls, in the floorboards, and these eggs will hatch and start the cycle anew. So most people simply learn to live with the bedbugs, accepting the nightly feedings as yet another discomfort to be endured, another price of surviving winter in a medieval castle. The wealthy might have one advantage: they can afford to burn aromatic substances that may help mask the worst smells and possibly discourage some insects. They burn frankincense and myrrh, expensive resins imported from distant lands, letting the sweet smoke drift through their chambers. They burn local herbs too: sage, thyme, juniper berries. These create pleasant smells and a sense of doing something, of taking action against the filth, even if the action is largely ineffective. The smoke may drive some insects away temporarily, but it does not kill them, does not eliminate the conditions that allow them to thrive. It is a psychological comfort more than a practical solution. The poor have no such comforts. They live with the smells, with the insects, with the dirt, having no resources to even attempt mitigation. A servant girl sleeps on her pallet, scratching at flea bites, breathing air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and old food and damp stone. She has no herbs to burn, no resins to make the air smell sweeter. She has only her exhaustion, which eventually pulls her into sleep despite the discomfort, despite the itching, despite everything. And in sleep she dreams sometimes of summer, of warmth, of the impossible luxury of feeling truly clean. But these are only dreams. When she wakes, winter remains, cold and filthy and inescapable. As January gives way to February, the situation worsens. The stores of food begin to run low. The preserved meats, the barrels of grain, the wheels of cheese, all are being consumed faster than anticipated, because the cold is more severe, because the winter is harder than expected, because the calculations made in autumn were optimistic. When food is scarce, hygiene becomes even less of a priority. The energy required to maintain even minimal standards of cleanliness is energy that could be used to stay warm, to work, to survive. So standards slip further. The rushes on the floor are not changed. The chamber pots are emptied less frequently. The soiled linens pile up in corners, waiting for a day warm enough to attempt washing them. People begin to look gaunt. Their faces hollow out. Their eyes sink into their skulls. Their bodies consume their own flesh to stay alive. Hunger has its own smell, sharp and acidic, the smell of a body eating itself. This smell joins all the others, layering into the complex reek that fills the castle. Morale declines. Arguments break out over trivial matters. The cold and hunger and filth erode patience, erode kindness, reduce people to their most basic selves, focused only on survival, on getting through one more day, one more night. In these conditions, illness spreads quickly. Someone develops a cough, and within days, half the castle is coughing. A child develops a fever, and then the child dies, and then other children sicken. The causes are mysterious, attributed to bad air, to the will of God, to the alignment of stars. No one understands about bacteria and viruses, about the way disease spreads through contact with contaminated surfaces, through breathing air that has been exhaled by the sick, through eating food prepared by unwashed hands. So the illness spreads unchecked, moving through the castle, killing some, sparing others according to no pattern that makes sense to the medieval mind. The dead must be dealt with, but in winter, burial is difficult. The ground is frozen solid, impossible to dig. So bodies are sometimes stored in unheated outbuildings, frozen into stiff poses, waiting for the thaw when they can be properly buried. Or they are placed in shallow graves scraped out of ground that is only partially frozen, covered with stones to keep animals from digging them up. These makeshift graves are markers of winter's cruelty. For those who survive, who make it through the worst of winter, February represents the beginning of the end. The days are getting longer, imperceptibly at first, but longer. The sun, when it appears, has a different quality to it, still weak but less utterly hopeless. There is a sense, more psychological than real, that the worst may be over, that spring will come eventually, that this frozen nightmare will end. This sense does not make the conditions any better. The castle is still cold, still filthy, still filled with hungry, sick, desperate people, but it makes the conditions more bearable, because there is now a finish line in sight, a promise that this will not last forever. Women begin to plan for spring cleaning, that great annual effort to undo the damage of winter. They talk about the tasks that will need to be done, emptying and restuffing all the mattresses, washing every piece of linen in the castle, scrubbing the walls and floors, changing out the rushes, opening the shutters to let in fresh air and sunlight. These plans are both exciting and daunting. The work will be enormous, requiring weeks of intense labor, but it will also be transformative, a chance to restore the castle to something approaching livable, to wash away the accumulated filth of winter and start fresh. But spring is still weeks away. It is only late February, and March can be cruel, bringing late snowstorms and unexpected cold snaps. So the women continue their winter routines, continue managing their bodies and their spaces as best they can with inadequate resources and hostile conditions. They wake in the morning to frost on the walls. They dress in layers that have not been washed. They eat with dirty hands. They work through the day, accumulating more dirt, more sweat, more evidence of their body's functions. They sleep at night in soiled beds, wrapped in unwashed blankets, surrounded by insects and smells and the ever-present cold. This is not the glamorous life portrayed in romantic tales of medieval times. There are no beautiful maidens in flowing gowns, no sense of courtly elegance and refinement. There is only survival day by day, using whatever means are available, in conditions that are actively hostile to human comfort and dignity. The women of the medieval castle are not delicate creatures needing rescue. They are survivors, hardened by cold and deprivation, capable of enduring conditions that would break modern people within days. Their bodies bear the marks of their lives. Their hands are rough and chapped, the skin cracked and bleeding in places. Their faces are weathered by cold wind and smoke. Their teeth are rotting or missing. Their hair is dull and brittle. Their skin is marked by scars, by rashes, by the evidence of illness and injury. They do not look like the women in paintings or tapestries. They look like people who have been through something difficult, which is exactly what they are. And yet there is a kind of strength in them, a resilience that is impressive even as it is born of necessity. They get up each morning and face another day of cold and discomfort. They manage their body's needs in conditions that make dignity nearly impossible. They care for children and the sick. They prepare food and maintain some semblance of order in the chaos of winter. They do all this without complaint for the most part, because complaint achieves nothing, because everyone is suffering equally, because this is simply life and must be endured. The noble women among them have a particular burden. They must maintain appearances even when appearances are nearly impossible to maintain. A lady of the castle cannot be seen with dirty fingernails, so she wears gloves, soft leather gloves that hide the state of her hands. She cannot let her hair be seen in its unwashed state, so she keeps it covered always, hidden beneath veils and coifs. She cannot appear to smell bad, so she carries her pomander, holds it to her nose frequently, lets the scent of dried flowers mask the scent of her unwashed body. She must sit gracefully at meals, must make pleasant conversation, must perform the role of a refined lady even when she is just as cold, just as dirty, just as uncomfortable as the servants who wait on her. This performance is exhausting. It requires constant vigilance, constant management of how she is perceived. A single lapse, a moment when the mask drops, could damage her reputation, could make her seem less than, could reduce her status in the eyes of others. So she maintains the performance through sheer force of will, through the understanding that her position in the social hierarchy depends on these appearances, these demonstrations of refinement that are entirely fictional given the actual state of her body and her surroundings. The servants have no such performance to maintain. They are expected to be dirty, to smell bad, to show the evidence of their labor on their bodies and clothing. In some ways this is a freedom. They do not have to pretend to be clean when they are not. They can scratch their lice bites openly. They can wipe their noses on their sleeves. They can acknowledge their discomfort without it threatening their identity. But it is a freedom born of low status. And low status brings its own burdens. Harder work, worse living conditions, less food, less warmth, less of everything except suffering. As winter drags on toward its eventual end, the women of the castle exist in a kind of suspended state. They are not truly living, not in the sense of thriving or growing or experiencing joy. They are simply surviving, maintaining the minimum necessary to keep their bodies alive, waiting for the conditions to improve enough that life can resume its normal patterns. This suspended state has its own strange quality, a dreamlike feeling where time moves both too slowly and too fast, where days blur together into an undifferentiated mass of cold and discomfort. Memory becomes unreliable. Did that argument with another servant happen yesterday or last week? When did you last change your chemise? How long has it been since you felt truly warm? The answers to these questions seem to shift and slide, impossible to pin down with certainty. There is only now this moment, this task, this small struggle. The past is frozen behind you, the future is unimaginable, and the present is all there is. In this eternal present, the small comforts take on outsized importance. A moment near the fire, when your hands stop aching from cold, becomes a memory to be treasured. A bite of fresh bread, still warm from the oven, is a sensory experience so intense it almost brings tears. A night when you sleep without waking from cold or nightmares is a gift so rare it feels like a miracle. These tiny moments of non-suffering are what keep you going, what remind you that life contains more than just hardship, even if those moments are brief and far between. The women talk to each other, quietly, in the small spaces of time when they are not working. They share stories, memories of better times, hopes for the spring. They create a kind of community in their shared suffering, a recognition that they are all enduring the same conditions, all struggling with the same challenges. This community is not always kind. There are jealousies, rivalries, resentments that fester in the close confines of winter. But there is also solidarity, a sense that they are in this together, that they understand each other in ways that the men of the castle do not. The men, after all, have different concerns. They worry about defense, about the supplies of weapons and arrows, about the possibility of attack even in the depths of winter. They drink heavily, gathering in the great hall to consume ale and wine, to boast and argue and occasionally fight. They do not talk about cold or hunger, or the difficulty of maintaining hygiene. These are women's concerns, beneath the notice of men who see themselves as warriors and protectors. But the women know better. They know that the real survival of the castle depends not on swords and shields, but on the daily work of managing bodies and spaces, of keeping people fed and warm and as clean as possible in impossible conditions. This knowledge is both a burden and a source of quiet pride. The women may not be celebrated, may not have songs sung about them or tapestries woven in their honor, but they know their own worth. They know that without their work, the castle would descend into complete chaos within days. They are the ones who keep life going, who maintain the fragile systems that allow human habitation of these stone fortresses. Their work is invisible to history, but it is essential to survival, and so they continue day after day through the long tail end of winter. They wake, they dress, they work, they eat, they sleep. They manage their periods, their pregnancies, their children. They wash what can be washed and ignore what cannot. They endure the lice, the bedbugs, the cold, the hunger, the endless grinding discomfort of bodies that cannot be kept clean. They do all this without fanfare, without acknowledgement, because this is simply what must be done, what has always been done, what will continue to be done until someday. The women of the castle look at this thaw with both relief and trepidation. Relief because the worst is over, because warmth is returning, because soon it will be possible to be clean again. Trepidation because the work that spring demands is enormous, because their bodies are exhausted from winter's deprivations, because there is so much to do and so little energy with which to do it. But they will do it. They always do. They will scrub and wash and restore and renew, turning the filthy castle of winter back into a livable space. And when next winter comes, they will endure it again, because this is life. This is survival. This is what it means to be a woman in a medieval castle, trapped by stone and season and circumstance, doing what must be done to keep life going through the darkness and cold. The story of their hygiene is not a story of cleanliness. It is a story of compromise, of adaptation, of finding ways to survive when survival seems impossible. It is a story of bodies that could not be kept clean, that leaked and smelled and itched and deteriorated, but that nonetheless continued to function, to work, to create life and sustain it. It is a story that has been mostly forgotten, deemed too mundane for the historical record, too undignified to be commemorated. But it is a story worth telling, worth remembering, because it reveals a truth about human existence, that we are embodied creatures, vulnerable to cold and dirt and disease, and that much of history has been made not by those who fought battles or signed treaties, but by those who simply kept living through circumstances that actively tried to kill them. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep in your warm bed, clean and comfortable, spare a thought for those medieval women who never knew such luxury, who spent their winters dirty and cold and uncomfortable, who survived nonetheless. Their strength was quiet, their victories private, their legacy largely unrecorded. But they lived, they endured, and in their endurance, they kept civilization going through the darkest, coldest, most difficult months of every year, doing work that no one celebrated, but that everyone depended upon. Their story is not pleasant, it is not comfortable, but it is real and it is human, and it is worth carrying with you into your dreams. Hello, my dear friends. Welcome back to another journey through history, where the past whispers its secrets in ways that might disturb your sleep, or perhaps guide you gently into it. Tonight we venture into an era of lace and lamplight, of cobblestone streets and coal smoke, where beneath the veneer of respectability lay habits so strange, so unsettling, that they feel almost impossible to believe. We speak of the Victorian age, that gilded period of progress and propriety, where the pursuit of cleanliness was a paradox wrapped in contradiction, and where hygiene was less a science than a performance of virtue. Before we begin, if you find comfort in these slow journeys through forgotten corners of history, if the rhythm of these tales helps you drift into restful sleep, consider staying with us for more nights like this. There is no pressure, only an invitation to return when you need the strange comfort of the past to ease you into the present moment of rest. Now, settle deeper into your pillows. Let the weight of the day dissolve. Dim the lights around you. Perhaps turn on a fan for that gentle hum of white noise, and allow yourself to be carried backward in time, to a world where bathing was a luxury, where dirt was a companion, and where the line between purity and decay was drawn in the most peculiar places. Let us walk together through the dim corridors of Victorian homes, where candles flickered against walls that held secrets no soap could wash away. If you stepped into a Victorian home on a Saturday evening, when the week's labor had settled into the bones of every person within, you might find the entire family gathered around a single wooden tub. It stood in the center of a small kitchen, perhaps near the fireplace where warmth still clung to the bricks, filled with water that had once been clear, but now shimmered with a dull, cloudy opacity. Steam rose faintly at first, curling upward like the ghosts of cleanliness, then fading as the night wore on and the water cooled. Bathing was not a private ritual in those days, not a solitary act of self-care performed behind locked doors. It was a shared experience, a domestic ceremony that bound the family together in ways both intimate and unsettling. The same water that touched the father's work-stained skin, that absorbed the grime of his labor and the scent of his day, would later be used by the mother and finally by the children. It was not done out of neglect, nor from a lack of love, but from the brutal calculus of necessity. Water was expensive to heat, requiring time and fuel that few could afford to waste. Soap, that precious substance, was reserved and rationed, used sparingly as though it were a luxury rather than a necessity. Cleanliness, in the Victorian understanding, was not a right but a privilege, something that only the fortunate could truly afford. The act of washing became a sequence, an order determined by hierarchy and practicality. The first to bathe was often the head of the household, the father whose body carried the dust of the street, the scent of tobacco, the oils of machinery or earth. The surface of the water quickly grew dull with the residue of his presence, a thin film forming as the minutes passed. The mother would take her turn next, dipping carefully into what remained, hoping that some vestige of warmth might still cling to her skin. The children waited in silence, their eyes watching the floating debris circle the rim of the tub, bits of soap scum and hair drifting like small islands in a grey sea. To modern sensibilities, this sounds absurdly unhygienic, almost grotesque in its disregard for basic sanitation, but at the time it was considered not only efficient, but respectable. To waste clean water, to pour it out unused and refill the tub for each person, was unthinkable for the working poor. A single bucket of water had to serve multiple purposes: washing bodies, scrubbing floors, preparing food. The idea of separate baths for each family member was a fantasy reserved for novels about the aristocracy, a dream that belonged to a world most would never touch. The ritual took hours to complete. Towels were scarce, often little more than old cloths or garments set aside for the purpose of drying. Bodies were patted dry with fabric that had already absorbed the moisture of another, the damp air filling the small room until everything felt heavy with wetness. Soot from the fire clung to the moisture in the air, leaving a thin film on the walls that would darken over time. The floor grew slippery with spilled water and soap, and the smell of wet fabric mixed with the faint sweetness of cheap soap, creating an atmosphere that was both comforting and suffocating. There was no sense of shame in this process, no embarrassment in the shared intimacy of the bath. Families talked and joked, carried on conversations as if nothing were unpleasant about their situation. Dirt, after all, was universal. It touched everyone, rich and poor alike, and if cleanliness was momentary, then dirt was eternal. The important thing was not to be truly clean, but to appear clean, to present oneself to the world with a washed face on Sunday morning, to signal dignity and self-respect, even if the body beneath the clothes told a different story. For the wealthy, conditions improved only marginally. Their tubs were lined with metal, often copper or tin, and servants carried in buckets of hot water from the kitchen, laboring up narrow staircases with loads that made their arms tremble. But even in grand houses where chandeliers cast golden light and Persian rugs covered marble floors, the bath was seldom emptied after each use. Heating water took time and fuel, both costly commodities even for those who could afford them. The same bath might serve several members of the household before being thrown out into the yard or garden. Perfumed oils or herbal sachets were sometimes added to disguise the staleness, turning the water into a perfumed illusion of hygiene, a theatrical performance where scent replaced substance. In modern terms, it would be like sharing a single bath water with your entire apartment building, each person adding a drop of cologne to pretend the water was fresh, to maintain the collective delusion that cleanliness had been achieved. The absurdity of it, when viewed through contemporary eyes, is almost comical. Yet to the Victorians this was simply life, the normal rhythm of domestic existence. Servants bore the worst of it, as they bore the worst of most things in that hierarchical world. They cleaned the tubs, hauled the buckets, scrubbed the rings of scum from the sides, and were often the last to wash if they washed at all. In crowded servant quarters tucked beneath the eaves or in basement rooms that never saw sunlight, a small basin was all they had, filled from the kitchen spout or a pump in the yard. The water might be reused afterward to scrub boots or wash dishes. The boundary between cleaning the body and cleaning objects blurred beyond recognition. Illness spread easily in such conditions, moving invisibly from person to person, from surface to skin. Yet few made the connection between disease and the ritual of shared water. The prevailing belief, the scientific consensus of the age, held that visible dirt was the enemy, not invisible bacteria. If the skin looked clean, if it appeared free of grime, then it was clean enough. The unseen world of microbes and pathogens had not yet entered the public imagination, and so the Victorians lived in a kind of ignorance that was both blissful and deadly. Children grew up thinking this routine was normal, that it was the natural order of things. They splashed in murky water, laughed at the floating bits of soap or strands of hair, and climbed out shivering but satisfied, wrapped in coarse towels that scratched their skin. Mothers wrapped them tightly, proud that their family had bathed that week, proud that they had fulfilled their duty to decency and respectability. To them, cleanliness was not about health, not about preventing disease or maintaining the body's well-being. It was about respectability, about social standing, about being able to walk into church on Sunday morning with a washed face and clean hands, even if the rest of the body told a different story. A clean appearance meant dignity. It meant you were not one of the unwashed masses, not one of those unfortunate souls who had given up on propriety altogether. No one questioned whether the same water that had touched 6 bodies before theirs might be carrying something dangerous. The thought simply did not occur to them. Public bathhouses existed in some cities, communal spaces where the working classes could pay a small fee for access to hot water and a tub. But they were viewed with deep suspicion, considered morally questionable places where decency might be compromised. Men and women bathed separately, in different rooms or at different times, Yet gossip about indecency and impropriety kept many families away. The irony was sharp and painful. Those who avoided public baths for the sake of decency, for the preservation of their moral reputation, often lived surrounded by filth in private, their homes breeding grounds for disease, their bodies harboring infections that could have been prevented with proper hygiene. It fascinates me, even now across the gulf of more than a century, how morality so often replaced practicality in Victorian life. How the ideal of virtue outweighed the need for genuine cleanliness and health. Doctors occasionally warned about the dangers of infections from reused bathwater. Medical journals published articles describing skin diseases, rashes, fevers, and other ailments that seemed to cluster in families or households. But explanations were vague, couched in the language of humours and constitutions rather than germs and bacteria. Germ theory was still new, still controversial, and many educated people thought illness came from bad air, from miasma that rose from swamps and sewers, rather than from contaminated surfaces or shared water. Bathing remained more symbolic than medical, more about performing respectability than achieving actual cleanliness. To bathe together was to share warmth, to affirm family unity, to demonstrate thrift and self-discipline, even if it meant sharing bacteria as well, even if it meant passing infections from one body to another. The ritual bound the family together, quite literally through the same water. Over time, as the century progressed and the horrors of cholera and typhoid became impossible to ignore, soap manufacturers and public health reformers began to promote personal cleanliness as a moral duty. Advertisements appeared in newspapers and magazines, showing cherubic children in spotless tubs, their faces glowing with health and innocence, promising purity through purchase. But for most families, the cost of such comfort was far beyond reach. They continued their Saturday baths, unaware or unwilling to believe that the water they saved to spare expense might be costing them their health, that the very ritual meant to cleanse them was slowly poisoning them. The tub itself became a symbol of thrift and togetherness, an emblem of family unity, though what it really held was the residue of poverty. The accumulated grime of lives lived too close to the edge of survival. Cleanliness, like everything else in the Victorian world, was measured by class. The wealthy could afford more water, more soap, more towels, but even they clung to habits that seem incomprehensible today. The poor simply could not afford to do better, and so they did what they had always done, what their parents and grandparents had done before them. Evening came. The water cooled to room temperature and then below, and the last child stepped out, teeth chattering, skin tinged blue from the cold. The father might nod with satisfaction, pleased that his family had fulfilled their obligation. The mother would pour what remained of the water into the street drain, watching it disappear into the darkness, and the tub would be covered with a cloth until next week, when the entire ritual would begin again. In that moment, standing in the dim kitchen with the fire dying down to embers, they believed they had done their duty to decency. They could face Sunday morning with the confidence of the clean, with heads held high, even if their cleanliness was only skin-deep, even if it lasted only as long as it took to walk from the house to the church. It is grimly amusing in a way that a family could feel so renewed by a bath that looked more like soup than water, that resembled the contents of a washing tub after a full day's laundry, rather than anything that could truly cleanse. Yet in a society obsessed with appearances, where how you looked mattered infinitely more than what you actually were, even filth could masquerade as virtue. Standing beside that tub, if you had been there, you could have seen both pride and despair coexisting quietly under the same roof. The pride of having maintained standards, of not having given up on respectability entirely. The despair of knowing on some unspoken level that this was not enough, that true cleanliness remained forever out of reach. The ritual of the shared bath captured everything essential about Victorian life, the thrift born of necessity, the endurance required to survive, and the elaborate illusions constructed to make survival bearable. The family believed they had conquered dirt, but all they had really done was rearrange it, move it from one body to another, dilute it slightly, but never eliminate it. Water was scarce, coal was expensive, and ignorance was plentiful. What was left behind in that tub was not just grime, but a reflection of a world struggling desperately to appear civilized, to maintain the facade of progress even as it foundered in its own accumulated waste. That night, as the last candle burned low and finally guttered out, the house returned to stillness. The air was thick with moisture and the smell of damp wool, the floor still wet in places, and the scent of cheap soap barely covered the underlying smell of sweat and unwashed bodies. In the morning, clothes would be pressed with hot irons heated over the fire, and smiles would return to faces as if purity could last, as if the illusion of cleanliness were the same as cleanliness itself. Some habits, however, clung stubbornly to the body, resistant to soap and water and all the performative rituals of respectability. There were still things, invisible things that they would never wash away. The family left the tub behind, stored in its corner, until next Saturday, believing themselves refreshed and renewed. Yet the dirt lingered, invisible to the eye but alive and thriving, microscopic and patient, waiting for the next opportunity to manifest as illness or infection. Victorian women began each day in a way that seems almost unbearable to imagine now, fastening layers upon layers of clothing that trapped heat, sweat and dust close to the body, creating a private climate that was humid, warm, and perfect for the cultivation of bacteria. Beneath the corsets that cinched their waists into fashionable shapes and the petticoats that rustled with every movement lay a single piece of clothing rarely discussed in polite society, yet constantly worn: the undergarment. It was not the delicate lace confection that modern minds might imagine, but thick, stiff cotton or wool, designed far more for modesty than for comfort. Most women owned only a few pairs of these essential garments, and many possessed just one or two. Washing them daily was completely out of the question, an impossible luxury that no one even considered. The fabric absorbed everything: moisture from the skin, odor from the body, the dust and grime that settled from the air. But it took days to dry, especially in the damp English climate where fog hung in the streets and rain drizzled almost constantly during certain seasons. Water itself was too precious to waste on something that could not be seen, something hidden beneath layers of more respectable clothing. The result was predictable, though rarely acknowledged. Garments meant to protect cleanliness instead became carriers of grime, repositories of sweat and bacteria that pressed constantly against the most intimate parts of the body. It is quietly horrifying to think that what Victorians called decency, what they held up as the standard of proper feminine behavior, was often soaked through with days or even weeks of accumulated sweat, staining yellow at the seams, developing an odor that no amount of perfume could completely mask. Laundry was heavy labor, the kind of work that broke backs and reddened hands until they cracked and bled. Heating enough water to properly wash clothing required building up the fire, filling large copper pots, waiting for the water to boil, then carefully adding the garments and stirring them with long wooden paddles, scrubbing cloth by hand, wringing it out with all the strength in your arms. This demanded time and physical strength that working women, already exhausted from their daily labor, rarely possessed. Soap was expensive, harsh enough to burn the skin after prolonged contact, and used so sparingly that it barely made a dent in truly soiled fabric. Many women preferred to simply hang their undergarments near a window, letting the air circulate around them, believing that this airing out was sufficient to refresh them. The illusion of freshness was enough. Scented sachets filled with dried lavender or rose petals were tucked between layers of clothing, or a few drops of perfume were sprinkled onto the fabric, intended to disguise rather than eliminate the smell that accumulated with each passing day. In modern times, this would be roughly equivalent to wearing the same gym clothes for a week or more, then simply spraying them with perfume and putting them back on before heading out to a formal event. Yet within the tight moral codes that governed Victorian society, codes that dictated every aspect of a woman's appearance and behavior, this was entirely acceptable, even expected. Clean appearance mattered infinitely more than actual cleanliness. If you looked respectable, if your outer clothing was pressed and your hair was neatly arranged, then what lay beneath those visible layers did not matter, because no one would ever see it. And speaking of such things, was considered deeply inappropriate. The garments themselves were cumbersome and uncomfortable. Drawers, as they were called, tied at the waist with ribbons or tape, and many were split at the crotch for convenience when using the chamber pot or privy, a practical design that also meant the fabric pressed directly against the skin with nothing to protect it. They chafed constantly, especially in warm weather or after hours of activity, causing rashes and sores that women endured in silence because complaining about such matters was unthinkable. Women sat, walked, climbed stairs, performed their daily labor, and slept in these same garments. Doctors of the time, operating with incomplete understanding of hygiene and infection, blamed what they called female delicacy for such ailments, attributing skin problems to weak constitutions or nervous dispositions, rather than to the filthy fabric that clung to women's bodies day after day. Even gentlewomen who could afford multiple changes of clothing often wore each piece for several days, or even a full week, before sending it to be laundered, and the laundresses who washed the clothing of the wealthy had strict priorities. Outer garments first, undergarments last, and their own clothing almost never. Servants, who formed the invisible backbone of middle-class and upper-class Victorian households, washed their employers' linen first, spending hours scrubbing and rinsing and hanging, and attended to their own clothing last, if they had the energy remaining at all. Sometimes they simply had no time or strength left for their own needs. In poor households, washing was often a public act, performed at the communal pump in a courtyard, or at the riverbank where women gathered, standing ankle-deep in cold water that numbed their feet, scrubbing clothes against stones until their knuckles split and bled. It was easier, far easier, to let undergarments go unwashed than to endure that pain and chill, especially in winter when ice formed at the edges of the river and the wind cut through wet fabric like knives. Some women rinsed their undergarments quickly in cold water, then hung them indoors where damp fabric filled the air with a sour, heavy scent that mixed with the smell of cooking and bodies and coal smoke. Husbands complained about the smell and the moisture, but few ever offered to help, and the burden remained entirely on the women's shoulders. In many homes, women quietly accepted this burden of dirt as part of their duty, as one more sacrifice required of them by a society that demanded everything and offered little in return. It is remarkable, even moving in a tragic way, how resilience can gradually turn into resignation when society calls that suffering virtue, when endurance is praised as the highest feminine quality and complaint is seen as weakness or moral failing. For those who worked in factories or served in wealthy households, the problem deepened and became almost unbearable. Long hours of labor left no time for washing, and shared quarters offered no privacy, no space to hang drying clothes, no opportunity to tend to personal needs. Undergarments were worn until they literally could no longer be tolerated, until the smell became so overwhelming that even the wearer could not ignore it, and then they were simply turned inside out to extend their use for a few more days, the soiled side pressed against the skin, the slightly less soiled side facing outward. When finally washed, they were scrubbed harshly, often with the same harsh lye soap used for dishes and floors, then boiled if possible to kill the lice and other vermin that often infested clothing, a process that shortened the fabric's lifespan significantly, but was necessary to make the garments even remotely wearable. The odor of damp, overboiled fabric became a constant companion in working-class homes, the scent of exhaustion and poverty that clung even after the fabric dried. Yet to speak of such things was absolutely taboo. The silence around bodily reality, around the basic functions and needs of human flesh was one of Victorian society's strangest and most damaging hypocrisies. Advertisements slowly began to appear in newspapers and women's magazines, promoting various laundry aids and scented soaps, promising to make the work easier and the results more satisfactory. But these advertisements targeted the middle class, women who could afford to purchase such products and who had servants to actually perform the labor. The poor remained invisible in these marketing campaigns, their hygiene judged harshly by those above them, but never supported, never acknowledged. Even among the wealthy, however, washing intimate garments was considered too improper to mention in polite company. Laundresses handled the task discreetly, their hands raw and painful from constant exposure to harsh chemicals and hot water, working in steamy basement laundries where the air was thick enough to choke on. They carried home with them the residue of other people's respectability, the chemical burns and respiratory problems that came from years of handling lye and bleach, and their own cottages were filled with tubs of grey water and piles of steaming linen that told a story rarely acknowledged. The hidden labour that kept Victorian morality looking spotless in public while remaining filthy in private. The combination of tightly laced corsets, multiple heavy petticoats and rarely washed underwear created absolutely perfect conditions for infections of all kinds. Skin could not breathe through the layers of fabric. Moisture was trapped against the body with no way to evaporate. Friction from walking and moving caused small abrasions and sores that, in the warm, damp environment beneath the clothing, easily became infected. Doctors in their medical journals and private correspondence noted increasing complaints from their female patients. Vague ailments of the skin and reproductive system, persistent rashes, painful sores, inexplicable fevers. But few medical men at the time questioned whether the clothing itself might be part of the problem. Instead, they prescribed tonics and rest cures. They recommended sea air and changes of scene. They spoke vaguely about nervous exhaustion and the inherent weakness of the female constitution. They rarely, if ever, suggested that perhaps wearing the same unwashed undergarments for weeks at a time, pressed tightly against the body by rigid boning and layers of fabric, might be causing the very symptoms they were treating. The female body, they confidently asserted, was naturally fragile, prone to mysterious ailments that science could not fully explain. They ignored the obvious fact that the very garments meant to preserve feminine modesty and propriety were actively damaging women's health, causing suffering that women endured in silence because they had been taught that their bodies were shameful. That speaking of such intimate matters was unacceptable, that suffering was simply part of being a woman. Cleanliness, in the Victorian understanding, was primarily a moral ideal rather than a medical one. Being clean meant maintaining certain standards of appearance and behavior, following the rules of respectability, presenting oneself properly to society. It had very little to do with actual hygiene in the modern medical sense, and suffering, particularly female suffering, was simply accepted as part of womanhood, an inevitable burden that women bore with whatever grace they could muster. By the end of the 19th century, reformers and early feminists began to speak more openly about women's hygiene, publishing manuals and guides that encourage women to change their linen more frequently, to bathe more regularly, to pay attention to their bodies' needs. Yet even these progressive guides made assumptions that revealed their class bias. They assumed the reader had servants to help with the laundry, had access to hot running water, had the time and resources to implement their advice. For the vast majority of women, the working poor who kept Victorian society functioning, such advice was completely unreachable, as distant and impossible as a journey to the moon. Poverty and social pressure combined to make washing an act of privilege rather than a basic right. Many women felt profound shame when they could not maintain the standards society demanded of them, though the standards themselves were unreasonable, based on assumptions about resources and support that most women simply did not have. To appear clean was essential, for maintaining social standing and respectability. To actually be clean was optional, a luxury that only some could afford. The line between the two blurred until no one could tell the difference anymore, until appearance became reality and reality became invisible. Inside the quiet bedrooms of Victorian houses, in the private spaces where women dressed and undressed away from public view, undergarments hung from chairs or from screens placed near the fireplace, slowly drying in the dim light. Their faint sour odor mingled with the scent of candle wax and damp wool, creating what might be called the domestic perfume of the age, a smell so common that most people stopped noticing it consciously, but that permeated everything. Women woke each morning and dressed quickly in the cold, fastening each layer with practiced efficiency, preparing to meet the day with the appearance of propriety and cleanliness, even when they knew the truth beneath their skirts. There was dignity in the effort, a kind of courage in maintaining standards, even when those standards were impossible to truly meet. It is oddly touching, across the gulf of more than a century, that they tried so hard to appear proper, to uphold the ideals of their society, while living in conditions that made real cleanliness almost impossible to achieve. The truth beneath their gowns and petticoats was simple and deeply unpleasant. The foundation of Victorian respectability, that elaborate structure of moral codes and social expectations, rested quite in a world that prized outward grace and proper appearance above almost everything else. The unseen could rot unnoticed, could fester and sicken without anyone acknowledging that something was wrong. The smell of soap and perfume might linger in parlors where guests were received, but in the hidden layers beneath the visible world, another scent told the true story. The odor of labor and fatigue and denial, of bodies trapped in clothing that was slowly poisoning them. Underneath the corsets with their rigid boning and the layers of cotton and wool, women carried daily proof of their society's contradictions, of a culture that preached cleanliness while making it nearly impossible to achieve, that valued appearance over health, that demanded impossible standards, and then blamed women for failing to meet them. The dirt was invisible to others, hidden beneath layers of respectable cloth, but it was undeniable to the women themselves, a constant, uncomfortable reminder of needs unmet and standards unfulfilled. It was the price of propriety paid in silence. Each day, a cost measured in discomfort and illness and quiet shame that was never supposed to be spoken aloud. They believed, these Victorian women, that the layers of fabric preserved their dignity, protected their reputations, marked them as respectable members of society. Yet those same layers held their hidden decay, trapped their sweat and odor, created the conditions for infection and illness. The silence around their bodies, around their actual physical experience of living in those clothes, was heavier than the garments themselves. And somewhere in that suffocating silence, buried under petticoats and propriety, the carefully constructed illusion of purity began to crumble, thread by thread, day by unwashed day. In the narrow streets of Victorian towns, where soot from countless coal fires clung to every brick surface and settled into every crevice, where the air itself seemed to carry the permanent scent of smoke and sweat and human industry, people found their own practical ways to manage the moisture that gathered on their skin throughout the long working day. For those without handkerchiefs, which were considered genteel accessories that marked one as a person of some refinement and means, sleeves became the most practical tool available. Cloth was expensive, and few working people could afford extra. Pieces meant solely for wiping away perspiration or other bodily fluids. A sleeve already attached to the body and forming part of the day's necessary armor against the world served well enough for most purposes. It soaked up the moisture that gathered on the face after hours of labor, absorbed the dampness from the neck and forehead, even served to wipe under the arms when the accumulation of sweat became too uncomfortable to ignore. There was no sense of embarrassment in this practice, no shame attached to such a fundamentally practical solution to a universal problem. It was simply habit, as natural as breathing. The mark of a hard-working person in that era was not cleanliness, which was impossible to maintain anyway, but endurance, the ability to keep going despite discomfort, to push through another day of labor regardless of how your body felt. It is strangely humbling to think that the same sleeve used to wipe away sweat might also be extended in a handshake to greet a neighbor or shake hands with an employer, still damp with yesterday's perspiration, carrying traces of the day's accumulated grime. Handkerchiefs were possessions that belonged primarily to the middle and upper classes. They were stitched delicately from fine linen or cotton, sometimes embroidered with initials or decorative patterns, lightly perfumed with rosewater or lavender, and displayed proudly as symbols of refinement and civilization. To own a handkerchief, to pull one from a pocket with a flourish, was to possess tangible proof of your social standing. Among laborers and the working poor, however, such niceties were not merely pointless, but actively absurd, an unnecessary expense, when survival itself demanded every penny. Men wiped their brows with the backs of their calloused hands, leaving streaks of dirt across their foreheads. Women pressed their sleeves to their faces while stirring pots over hot fires or tending to screaming children, trying to manage the sweat that ran freely in all seasons. Sweat was a constant companion through summer and winter alike, because Victorian working conditions meant heat regardless of the season. Factories trapped warmth from machinery, kitchens remained stifling from cooking fires that burned all day, workshops filled with bodies laboring in close quarters. Bodies adapted as best they could, and the primary adaptation was simply to accept sweat as a normal part of existence, something to be managed rather than eliminated. In modern sensibility, this would be roughly equivalent to replacing deodorant and tissues entirely with the sleeve of your jacket, then calling such behavior practical common sense. The line between basic hygiene and practical survival blurred so completely that few people noticed it existed at all, and those who did notice had neither the resources nor the energy to do anything about it. Clothing in Victorian times told stories if you knew how to read them. A dark patch under the arm of a shirt, visible when the wearer raised his hand, spoke of manual labor and honest sweat. A faint yellow circle at the wrist, where the fabric had absorbed repeated wipings, indicated a worker who had spent long hours at his trade. A hardened spot on the shoulder, where a sleeve had been pressed repeatedly to wipe away moisture, became a badge of endurance rather than a mark of shame. Each stain, each discoloration, served as evidence of daily struggle and survival. Society itself, in its complicated way, reinforced these ideas about cleanliness and labor. Respectable people, those with money and leisure, might look down upon the poor for their smell and their stained clothing, might wrinkle their noses and turn away when passing a laborer on the street. Yet those same respectable people relied absolutely on the labor that caused such uncleanliness, depended on workers who toiled in conditions that guaranteed they would smell of sweat and dirt. This quiet contradiction defined much of Victorian life. The middle and upper classes demanded services and goods that could only be produced by people working in conditions that made cleanliness impossible, then judged those same workers for failing to maintain standards that were never achievable in the first place. Women, as in so many aspects of Victorian life, suffered particularly from the challenges posed by heat and restrictive clothing. Corsets compressed their ribs and restricted breathing, making even mild exertion cause breathlessness and perspiration. Petticoats and multiple layers of skirts clung to damp skin, absorbing moisture, but never truly drying throughout the day. Bodices made of heavy fabric trapped every drop of sweat against the body. By midday, even for women who were not engaged in strenuous labor, the underarms of their dresses would darken with moisture. The edges of collars would stiffen with salt, and the peculiar scent of salt and starch would fill whatever room they occupied. Few women could afford multiple changes of clothing throughout the day. Laundry, as previously discussed, required extensive time and resources that most families lacked entirely. So garments were worn repeatedly, day after day, until they were almost stiff with the residue of dried sweat and the oils naturally produced by skin. Servants, those invisible workers who kept Victorian households functioning, would iron these clothes in the evening, pressing the fabric smooth with heavy irons heated over the fire, a process that sealed the sweat and odor into the fibers rather than removing it. The next morning, the same dress would be worn again, carrying with it the faint, sour smell of the previous day's exertion, and by noon that smell would return fully, mixing with fresh sweat to create a scent that was both sweet and sour, both human and slightly chemical. Among men, particularly those who worked as laborers in the docks, factories, construction sites, and along the rapidly expanding railway lines that were transforming Britain, the sleeve became almost an extension of the body itself, a multi-purpose tool. It wiped away not just sweat, but also soot, the black dust that fell constantly in industrial areas. It removed oil from hands after working with machinery. It stanched blood from small cuts and scrapes. It absorbed all of this with equal indifference, and water rarely touched it except when rain fell. The mixture of different substances, dirt and moisture and bodily fluids, hardened gradually into layers within the fabric, forming almost a second skin over the original cloth. Yet this accumulation was never seen as disgraceful or shameful. Hard work justified everything. The clean-shaven gentleman in his pressed suit might look down upon such conditions with distaste or even revulsion, but even he understood on some level that his own comfort depended entirely on. It fascinates me, looking back across time, how the very meaning of cleanliness depends so entirely on who can afford it, how standards shift and change based on class and circumstance. What appears as disgusting neglect from one perspective looks like practical survival from another. The smell of sweat filled every crowded space in Victorian Britain, taverns where workers gathered after their shifts, omnibuses and railway carriages packed with commuters, tenement buildings where dozens of families lived in close quarters sharing walls and sometimes rooms. Everyone contributed to this collective odor, and everyone breathed it in, a democratic sharing of human scent that crossed class lines even when nothing else did. It was simply the smell of effort, of bodies living and working without the luxury of frequent bathing or clean clothes. Only visitors to cities, people arriving from rural areas or from abroad, would notice and often recoil from this mixture of salt and damp fabric and unwashed skin. For the locals, for those who lived and worked there every day, it was simply the background scent of life itself. A passing breeze on a rare clear day might bring momentary relief, a few seconds when the air smelled of something other than human industry. But even the wind in Victorian cities carried its own burden of odors, of smoke from factories, of waste from inadequate sewers, of bodies working and living too close together. As the 19th century progressed and medical understanding slowly advanced, doctors began to make connections between sweat, uncleanliness, and various illnesses, though they often misunderstood the precise mechanisms. They associated heavy perspiration with sickness, believing that sweat itself might carry disease, rather than understanding that the conditions causing sweat, the poor ventilation and overcrowding and inadequate hygiene, were the real culprits. Some physicians advised moderation in physical exertion, warning that sweating too much might weaken the body, but they rarely offered practical advice about how working people might keep themselves clean when their survival depended on labor that guaranteed they would sweat. Other doctors, working from older medical theories, actually argued that sweating served to purify the blood, that the body expelled harmful substances through the skin, and that wiping sweat away too quickly or too frequently might be harmful by preventing this natural cleansing process. This half-truth, This misunderstanding, wrapped around a kernel of biological reality, gave comfort to those who could not do better anyway, who had no choice but to let sweat accumulate and hope for the best. They wore their stained sleeves and damp collars with a kind of reluctant pride, evidence of their willingness to work hard, to endure discomfort for the sake of their families. The poorest members of society never questioned whether the constant dampness beneath their clothes might be carrying disease, might be creating conditions where bacteria could thrive and infections could take hold. They had far more immediate concerns occupying their attention and consuming their limited energy. Finding enough food to eat, paying rent to avoid eviction, keeping their families together and alive. Survival in the moment took precedence over long-term health, and rightly so when starvation and homelessness were real and present dangers. At home, in the cramped spaces where working families lived, sleeves continued to serve multiple purposes beyond simply wiping away sweat. They cleaned children's faces, hastily wiped before the child went to school or before the family sat down to their meager meal. They polished eating utensils when no clean cloth was available. They brushed dust from the few pieces of furniture the family owned. The same fabric that touched skin also touched food, plates, cups, everything. Hygiene as a distinct concept, as a set of practices designed to prevent disease transmission, was still forming in the medical and public consciousness, still being debated in universities and medical societies, and the knowledge that was being developed in those elite spaces had not yet filtered down to ordinary people, living ordinary lives. Boundaries between clean and dirty were fluid and contextual, varying from one situation to another. When guests arrived at a humble home, even if those guests were simply neighbors or relatives, women might discreetly wet the edge of a sleeve with their tongue and use it to quickly wipe a child's mouth or face, removing visible dirt so the child looked presentable. To them, this was an act of maternal care, of ensuring their children met basic standards of appearance. They had no way of knowing that they might be spreading bacteria rather than removing dirt, that their loving gesture carried its own small risks. Laundry days, when they finally arrived after a week or sometimes longer, revealed the full picture of how clothing had been used and what it had absorbed. When clothes were boiled in large pots or tubs, the steam that rose was sour and thick, heavy with the smell of old sweat that had been trapped in fibers for days. When items were lifted from the water, dripping and heavy, the worst of the stains would have faded slightly, but most never vanished entirely. They would reappear soon enough, sometimes within hours of the clothing being worn again, the yellow and brown marks of accumulated sweat blooming like strange flowers on the fabric. No one expected perfection. No one thought clothing could truly be made completely clean again, not really. Even among the wealthy, where servants labored endlessly to maintain standards, keeping garments completely spotless was understood to be impossible. The illusion of freshness had to be good enough, because actual freshness could not be maintained. To wipe one's sweat with a sleeve, then, was not fundamentally an act of laziness or a sign of moral failing. It was adaptation to circumstances, a practical response to lives lived too close to physical labor, too far from any real comfort or luxury. The marks it left on clothing were not sources of shame, but rather signs of something essentially human, proof that bodies were being used for the work that kept society functioning. They told stories of laboring under the sun, of standing over hot fires or machines, of moving and working and sweating through another day. These stories were written in salt stains and darkened patches, in fabric worn thin at the wrists and stiff at the shoulders. It is quietly tragic in a way that survival could be so intimate with filth, pressed so closely together that they became almost indistinguishable, and yet simultaneously so distant from any real relief or solution. The Victorian belief in propriety, in maintaining proper appearances regardless of circumstances, depended fundamentally on accepting that cleanliness was primarily about surfaces and visibility. Beneath every polished exterior whether that exterior was made of expensive fabric or cheap rough cotton, lay the same reality. Fabric stiff with accumulated salt and sweat, carrying the traces of bodies that worked too hard and bathed too seldom. To shake someone's hand in greeting was to meet not just them but the trace of their entire day's exhaustion. To touch fabric that had absorbed their labor and their struggle. In the dim light of factories and workshops, in the steamy heat of kitchens and laundries, in the cramped spaces where families lived and slept and tried to maintain some semblance of dignity, sleeves moved constantly in the same repeated gesture, wiping and smearing and enduring. They carried forward proof of life itself, unrefined and mostly unacknowledged, accepted as normal because what alternative existed? Sweat did not merely stain clothing in Victorian Britain. It stained the air that people breathed, filled the streets where they walked, permeated the culture that simultaneously praised hard work and recoiled from its physical evidence. It became part of the invisible fabric of daily existence, woven tightly together with labor and silence and the small adaptations people made to survive circumstances they had not chosen and could not change. The sleeves eventually dried, usually overnight or during the brief periods when they were not being worn, but the smell lingered in every thread, absorbed so deeply into the fibers that no amount of airing or even washing could completely remove it. The stains told stories that no amount of soap could erase, stories of specific days and specific labor, of moments when the body exceeded its limits and had nowhere else to turn for relief. And as bodies kept working day after day and year after year, a new form of filth quietly settled beneath the clean illusion of society, beneath the pretense that Britain was becoming more civilized and refined. They dried their brows with their sleeves, wiped their children's faces with the same fabric, and called it good enough because it had to be good enough, because nothing better was available or even imaginable. The stains remained, the odor persisted, and life continued in the only way it could, one damp sleeve at a time.